Question is the motion be agreed. Member, Leader of the National Party.
Thank you.
I need to put the question.
Oh.
Yes, sorry, I just need to check that it's agreed. Question is the motion be agreed. All those in favour, aye. Those against, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Leader of the National Party.
Thank you, Madam Acting Speaker. Do I need to move the motion on the book?
You just read it through.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for your advice. So the motion reads that the Economics and Industry Standing Committee inquire into mining legacy state agreements struck prior to 1970 with the terms of reference including but not limited to the nature of past and current commitments and responsibilities between the companies and the state. B, whether current commitments and responsibilities are contemporary in the context of modern state agreements, mining practices and topical issues such as environmental responsibility. C, whether the agreements still represent a fair deal for the people of Western Australia as the owners of the resource. D, the impact of sovereign risk, should it be in the interests of the state to instigate changes to state agreements. And E, the nature of any residual value-adding commitments in the state agreements and, by extension, assurances to the people of WA that commitments are honoured.
That's your motion.
May I now proceed? That's the motion.
Thank you very much, Member.
Thank you. Madam Acting Speaker, every person in this place, I think, understands the importance of the mining sector here in Western Australia. The industry is certainly much larger than in other Australian states and territories. It is certainly something that I think most people have an understanding of the significance of what this sector contributes. Well over 900 mine sites, significant oil and gas activity, although a little bit less today as of the government's decision to announce yet another inquiry into fracking. So I'm not going to spend very much time talking about tonnages or prices, because if you were in this place, you should know the significance of the state's iron ore sector in particular, Madam Acting Speaker. And I do want to start this debate, or in terms of ventilating the issue in this place, around the premise that this government, this parliament, we always need to be able to find a balance between the demands and the needs of the resource sector and the sustainable development of our state, particularly for those communities who are impacted by that in regional Western Australia. And there should always be that healthy tension between government and the sector. We are the regulator, that is, the government is the regulator, and the parliament as the ratifier of the state agreements. And we also play the role of the facilitator, and so it is an interesting relationship that we have with the sector, because at times we are required to facilitate and encourage, others we are required to regulate. And I think if you go back and look over time, there have been times when the pendulum has swung from being certainly a key driver and facilitator. It swings back when there are tensions or issues that raise themselves within the community in relation to the sector where you take on that regulatory role, and it's always that tension. And I think that it's right to have the balance. The balance needs to be there, certainly because, not least of which, this parliament and the government of the day has responsibility for not only regulating the industry but making sure that we are developing those resources in the best interests of every Western Australian. It is our ore, it is finite, and we must make sure that we are getting the best outcome. I would also like to start this debate with the fact that, or to dispel any notion or thought that it is being brought to this place because the Nationals hate the mining sector. I know it's an easy and flippant thing for the Premier and others to say, and it certainly from time to time suits the narrative of the government, but I can assure you that it is very far from the truth, and we have members that represent areas of this state where there is significant resource activity, and I am one of those. I have one of the biggest gold mines in the state in my electorate, and certainly it has from time to time relationships with the community and impact on the community that requires some good understanding between government and community and from a regulatory point of view. I think any balanced analysis of policy, the support that has been provided, initiatives that we've instigated over the past 8 years when we were in government, and certainly before that, would dispel any notion that the Nationals don't like the mining sector. And I know I've been accused of being repetitive in this place when it comes to certain aspects of the legacy state agreements to which we are referring to today. And there wouldn't be one person in the state, I wouldn't have thought, that didn't know the policy that the Nationals took to the last state election in relation to the special lease rental. And members opposite may be sick of it, but they are not so far removed from opposition that they have forgotten the requirement to be persistent, to keep chipping away, to continue to raise the issues that we think are important, no matter what the government of the day believes, because the feedback that we get from the community and the principles on which that policy was set, I think, remain true to this day. The government itself is repetitive in its response to us raising these issues and concerns, and chooses, instead of engaging on the matter, to obfuscate and to ignore some of the real concerns that are raised within the community. Concerns that even the sector itself have recognised. And I think, and I've had a number of conversations with representatives of the sector since coming to this role, and members of the community, and the representatives of the sector themselves acknowledge that there has been damage done as a result of that relentless and exorbitant campaign that they ran. They concede that it has actually damaged the view of the public in relation to what the value of that industry is and how they conducted themselves. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They themselves recognise that there has been some challenges presented. And I also note the Premier's response that when asked about any issue in relation to state agreements, there's sort of a mixture of gushing support and gratitude towards the two major miners, coupled with a flat-out, we won't be tearing up state agreements. And again, that suits the narrative and his desire to be very close and shoulder to shoulder with these two big mining companies.
Some would say captured.
We could, indeed, member. And we all know what it means when you have a difference of opinion, and in very recent history when you've had a difference of opinion with two of these mining companies. And this government is most certainly going out of its way to avoid any of that type of conflict or disagreement. And I put forward, and the Nationals put forward, that this is not actually a healthy relationship. So I'd like to draw the House's attention to a concept that's known as institutional capture. And institutional capture, Madam Acting Speaker, one obvious effect of, and I'm quoting from an article titled FIFO and Global Production Networks Exploring the Issues by Al Rennie, and it says, one obvious effect of development focusing on a sector dominated by large companies is the threat of institutional capture. Harman has already pointed this out. Once an economy like Western Australia is shaped by the multinationals and governments to extract and export primary products efficiently, then it may become locked into this pattern. The very nature of the infrastructure, the labour skills, the technology, the government policy and so on become geared to that end. McMahon, 2009, is more critical, pointing to the growing influence of mining over the state. Small, unsophisticated state structures come under the sway of huge foreign and Australian mining concerns, and the ability of these mining interests to organise politically to promote their preferred policies is enhanced. And certainly that, to me, Madam Acting Speaker, describes some of the behaviours that we've seen over the past year. McMahon goes on to argue that the mining boom of the 1960s tied the state into global financial and industrial networks, or GPNs, and would show that by the end of the century, the state government had lost any real control, faced, for example, with the successful merged BHP and Billiton that had created the world's largest mining corporation. I think this concept of institutional capture is that the balance in the relationship between the government and these companies is gone. And to me, it is a fancy way of saying that the pendulum can swing too far towards accommodating the needs of and the demands of the resource sector. And it is the government's responsibility, Madam Acting Speaker, to ensure that that balance is right. A balance between the company's desire to progress and secure investment and to deliver the benefits that it can by delivering a successful project, and the desires and the aspirations of the community and the people of Western Australia, that they derive some benefit from these agreements that govern the actual operations of these companies. So, Madam Acting Speaker, this is why we bring this motion to the House. And if we can find time for yet another inquiry into fracking, we can most certainly find time to have an inquiry into some of the most important contracts that have been ratified by a parliament and are in existence today. An inquiry to canvass some of the issues that are the most the most enduring of contracts that this House ratified is most certainly important. And as I said yesterday during question time, this debate will also allow members of the government and other members in this place, and I would say particularly the member for Pilbara, I'm interested in hearing what his thoughts are, being the member that represents the resources province of Western Australia, to put their views on the record, Madam Acting Speaker, and to actually let us know why it is that an inquiry of this nature is not needed or shouldn't be pursued. And we will not mind if the member for Pilbara strays somewhat from the parameters of the inquiry and the terms of reference and the purpose of the motion, to put his thoughts on record, because there are some issues in his electorate that are very pertinent and are probably a symptom of some of this institutional capture, this balance that has become or gone awry over a number of years. Specifically in relation to the 700-bed FIFO camp that Woodside is wooing the government with at the moment. Issues like FIFO and the impact of these resource companies' decisions on regional communities like Karratha are actually central to the tenet of this argument that we will put forward, and the basis of why the inquiry is important. And tensions arise between the community and the company and government when these matters are not managed. And I remind the member for Pilbara, if he is listening today, that it is his job to speak on behalf of the community that he now represents, and he must educate himself as to what it is that matters to the people of the Pilbara. It was concerning to me when I read in the West Australian back in March, before the member was elected, that he had conceded that he was not well informed about the resources sector, Madam Acting Speaker. To quote, it's not my strong point, I'll be honest.
We'll wait till he speaks and we'll find out.
That is an outstanding statement. Remember, he said it himself. He said it himself. And it's an outstanding statement from a candidate that was seeking to represent the resource province of West Australia, the resource powerhouse. So this is how the member can demonstrate that he has applied himself in the first 6 months of government, that he has been working hard to understand the resource sector and the community that he says he is so passionate about, because I can tell you, Madam Acting Speaker, what the people of Karratha think about Woodside's proposal for a 700-bed FIFO camp. They think it stinks. And you can wrap it up in a nice bow and you can tell people that it's going to create jobs for the construction period, but at the end of the day, they all know it's a donga camp sitting on the outskirts of town, when there has been significant investment into those communities to make them livable and attractive places for families. And what's worse is that there are actually companies that are doing the right thing, that are proving that they can change their business model to make sure that they are committing to...
Can I draw your attention to the state of the House?
Yes, you may. Ring bells, quorum call.
It's important that the member for Pilbara hears what the
I'm pretty sure we need a quorum. 15? 16. There you go, quorum. Yes.
Vince,
20.
they might not show and have the house shut.
There's one. In? Kieran?
Do you want me to stay out?
No.
I didn't read my buzzer. That was
2. 3. Members, we are good to go. Leader of the Nationals.
So I encourage the member for Pilbara to put his views and make them known as a part of this debate, because I think he should be on his feet every day making sure that his ministers understand the enormous angst that community has in relation to the proposal that is in front of the Minister for Lands. You will all have a chance to say to have your say on our proposal for an inquiry into these legacy state agreements, and I do hope that everyone takes this opportunity. The Honourable Jackie Boydell, Terry Redman, myself, a member for member for Warren Blackwood, we have been to Karratha. We have actually spoken to these communities, and we've heard the frustrations of the council, of the business owners, the feelings of hopelessness, and well, it's almost inevitable, isn't it? They really feel like there's a bit of a return to the dark old days. And I think this, Madam Acting Speaker, is, again, it's a symptom, as I said before, of an unbalanced relationship between those large resource companies and the government, who is both a regulator and a facilitator of the sector. And it is the Nationals' position that every relationship from time to time needs a stocktake. And it is particularly pertinent to be having this debate now, given that we face some very strong financial headwinds in this state. And we have the budget coming down tomorrow. And these contracts, these state agreements, encapsulate significant financial obligations in return for allowing these companies to process our finite and very precious resource. And the debate will allow the Treasurer to demonstrate that he is making sure, as he said earlier in the week, that every sector is paying its fair share as we battle these tough economic headwinds. He can prove that he is indeed not leaving any stone unturned when it comes to budget repair. And it would be disappointing if the Treasurer didn't agree with the proposed inquiry, because he has in this place previously said, I actually think that state agreements have gone one way for years, and support the premise of what the member for Warren Blackwood was discussing in the House in relation to this previously. So the Treasurer at least has an inkling or an idea that there does need to be, from time to time, a stocktake. And surely it's timely for all members in this place to agree that an inquiry is appropriate. I'm not overly confident, though, Madam Acting Speaker. I feel I'm going to be disappointed, and that will be very disappointing for the members of the community that look to this place to be able to have respectful debates about such important contracts in a respectful and appropriate manner. I hope I will be proved wrong, but I suspect there will be member after member falling over themselves to profess their support for the mining sector and label this a witch hunt. And I can tell members that that is absolutely not what we are proposing. It couldn't be further from the truth. I do think that it is, however, appropriate, and the Nationals believe that it is appropriate, that we examine these state agreements, these legacy state agreements. And if the inquiry comes back with recommendations that increase the value the state is getting from these agreements and strengthens the position of these companies, then you have a reason to go to these companies and start these discussions. It is the role of every government to make sure that we ensure the state is getting the best value for its people, and to protect our long and short-term interests. And certainly that was the sentiment of Sir Charles Court when some of these agreements were first brought to the Parliament. Given that these agreements don't have end dates, and that the Department of State Development estimated that last year we only have around 69 years of iron ore left at current production levels. That's a Department of State Development document, and we're using figures from that report. I don't think we want to get another 50 years down the track and say we should have, we could have, we needed to make sure that we'd done a stock take. And I'm not saying there hasn't been stock takes along the way either, Madam Acting Speaker. There has. There's been inquiries and reports and reviews. There's been changes made. We are certainly not saying that they've drifted along for 50 years without some of those issues being addressed. But I do think, just at this particular point in time, with the strong financial headwinds that we have, the relationships that we have in a market that is now mature and very well understood, the time is now to have this inquiry that allows us to have a broader understanding of some of the things that are not immediately obtainable and understandable from a government or a parliament. There is precedent, and some of the other members on my team will talk about the precedent that's been set for inquiries and investigations. As I said, the Auditor-General has looked at various aspects of the management of state agreements over time and recommended changes. Anyone that's needing a 101 in state agreements, any of our newer members in the House, the Auditor-General's report from 2004, and there's another one in 2011, is quite useful. And on page 23 of this report, the Auditor-General, the one from 2004, the Auditor-General of the day states, there is a balance to be struck. Companies and their financiers require regulatory certainty over the life of a major project before committing significant capital funds needed for project construction and operation. However, in making their investment decision, companies are unlikely to rely on estimated rates of return for the whole of their life of their mineral lease. Some excess of 50 years, they will require a positive financial return within a much shorter period to justify their investment decision. To me, this actually is a reflection on the tension between the certainty the company requires to secure that finance and that confidence to go to their investors, and the length of time for which the agreement and the concessions that are included within that agreement are required. Our iron ore industry is no longer fledgling, certainly not the provinces that these legacy state agreements cover. It is a mature market. It is world renowned. We are globally recognised for the quality of our iron ore. The Pilbara is a household word across the world. It is no longer the 60s, and our trading partners very well understand our credentials. And we understand, whilst there's been amendments and updates to these agreements over the course of the time, we don't refute this. We are simply saying now, post the most significant construction mining boom the state has ever experienced, largely based around a resource that is at the centre of these legacy agreements, now is the time to make sure that these contracts are doing what they are intended to do in this modern day environment. So up until this point, Madam Acting Speaker, we will concede that a large part of our debate has been around the special lease rental. We went to the state election with a very specific and singular discussion point. Our plan, which members know and it has been canvassed in this place many times, was around trying to find a new revenue source for this state so that we didn't fall back on the mums and dads and ordinary households, small businesses to bear the brunt of a very poor return on our GST and obviously a significant challenge in dealing with a fluctuating iron ore price and a population boom. So that debate was sharp-pointed during the campaign, and the financial situation was and still one of the most, I think the most important thing that is facing this state. But the anomaly of the SLR and the state agreements is just one aspect of these legacy state agreements. And I think from our perspective, given that we are, I think without doubt, facing a very mean and distressing budget for households and businesses alike, that there is no call from the Treasurer asking whether or not these companies are willing to pay more. There is no notion that government is actually negotiating or sitting down or doing everything that they say they are doing. They aren't going down every rabbit hole. They aren't pursuing every avenue. You know, mums and dads don't have the luxury of being asked as to whether or not they want changes to contracts. They just get their electricity prices put up. They just get their water prices put up. And there is differences between an ordinary household, obviously, and these companies. But that is, you know, the mature relationship that a government and these contracts and the companies have should be that a government can go to these companies and say, we respect the fact that you've been operating in our state for a long period of time. We need to be able to have a discussion about whether or not the things that are governed in these agreements with no end are still doing the job that they were set out to do. So obviously the special lease rental has been rejected, at least by the Premier. I think the Treasurer still has a notion that at some point in time there will be an avenue for discussion in relation to that. And who knows, perhaps an inquiry like this would give some cover to the Treasurer and the government to have that discussion, and certainly we would be welcoming of any input from the Treasurer in relation to this. We are only proposing to frame the inquiry around the legacy state agreement struck prior to the 1970s, Madam Acting Speaker. So this is the Iron Ore Hamersley Range Agreement Act of 1963, which facilitated Rio Tinto's development of Tom Price, Paraburdoo and Dampier, the Iron Ore Robe River Agreement Act 1964, which facilitated Cliff's development of Robe River, the Iron Ore Mount Goldsworthy Agreement Act of 1964, which facilitated BHP's development of Goldsworthy Project, and the Iron Ore Mount Newman Agreement Act of 1964, BHP's development of Mount Whaleback Mine. And these companies were given very favourable concessions back at the time the agreements were struck, with the aim of delivering two key outcomes: establishing a successful mining sector in Western Australia, in the Pilbara, and also to undertake downstream processing activities that would utilise the low-grade ores that we have to create new industry, one that would be a major economic contributor for the state. And these agreements that we've referred to are often referred to as those pioneer agreements, because they did facilitate the development of the iron ore industry in that very remote Pilbara region in the 60s. But they are open-ended. And credit where credit is due, and I think every member of this House would agree that Sir Charles Court had great vision and determination and economic foresight in bringing the mining industry into being in WA, along with those that were part of his government. And these state agreements were very much the basis for establishing those major mining developments in the Pilbara. And we know at the time that lack of infrastructure, that extreme remoteness, the harsh conditions meant that that industrial development was a challenge, and it required external capital to actually be realised. And during that second reading debate of the Rio Tinto Iron Ore Hamersley Range Agreement bills, the Charles Court spoke of this capital expenditure required to establish the mines and the towns and the railways, the infrastructure, the ports, as well as the provision of suitable housing and recreational and other facilities and amenities, including schools and water and power supplies in an area that was completely underdeveloped. And the state didn't have the funds at that time, and nor probably would have had the funds in the foreseeable future to undertake any type of development of that scale. At the time, it was really interesting going back and looking at some of these debates in the House and reading the second reading speeches and the debates. He indicated, that is Sir Charles Court indicated, that only a substantial tonnage, which he equated to around 3 million or more tonnes per year by one company in a particular area, would make it reasonable for these agreements to be required. Madam Acting Speaker, Rio Tinto's Pilbara operations exported 327.6 million tonnes of ore just in 2016. So we've moved on. We've moved on. And it's clear that we are operating in an entirely different environment to the one that Sir Charles Court was overseeing 50 years ago. There was a long list of favourable concessions and exemptions in the operating environment for the agreements, including royalty concessions. There was the special lease rental, there was exemptions from stamp duty, there were exemptions from obligations to lodge environmental bonds, there were restrictions on local and state government land rating, zoning, resumption powers, there was concessions on paying land rates, and these agreements at the time had the ability to remove the ability of local councils to pay rates. Now, we're not saying that all of that is still in place, but certainly back in the day, that was the nature of those agreements. But Sir Charles Court was always very mindful of the need to protect both the short-term and the long-term interest of the state. He was concerned about what the enduring value of these developments would be, and so should we be. That should not change. No parliament should stray from that simply because these companies have become enormously successful, powerful, multinational global companies. And I note that in 2004, in an Auditor General report, he made the statement that there was limited disclosure outside of what was agreed in the original agreement. So that was 2004 Auditor General report. So he says, given the importance of agreements to the state, there should be regular disclosure of agreement status and performance to Parliament. Now, I'm not sure. I think in some cases that's required, certainly not in some of the legacy state agreements. There's requirements in more modern state agreements. There is no like for like in this type of discussion, but certainly for some of those significant agreements, you would think that the people of Western Australia, the Parliament who ratifies these agreements, the government, would be wanting to make sure that we understand full well what it is that we are deriving as a benefit. And you cannot value what you do not understand. And so this Parliament and the people of Western Australia, if it is not transparent or immediately understandable in a way that we can comprehend, then you don't and can't value what is being brought to the table. And so these agreements and accompanying documents are not actually that easy to find. And certainly we even found that when we were in government, Madam Acting Speaker. They are not easy to find, they are not easy to navigate, and they are not easy to interpret. And certainly the Auditor General on more than one occasion has noted that it is very difficult to see where there's been consistent reporting on the obligations that are within these agreements. Now, one of these obligations within the state agreements was, of course, Sir Charles Court's vision that there would be a downstream processing industry as a result of the development of this ore. And it's been canvassed many times, and again, I would point out that we're not saying this hasn't been attempted to be fulfilled by the companies over the course of time. It was one of the central tenets of these legacy agreements, and the final point that frames the terms of reference that we've put forward as an inquiry relates to the nature of any residual value-adding commitments in the state agreements, and by extension, the assurances to the people of WA that these commitments are honoured. So if we go back to 1973, Madam Acting Speaker, on November 8, Sir Charles Court was in the Parliament debating the Iron Ore Cleveland Cliffs Agreement Act Amendment Bill, and he said, "This will be the history of the Pilbara because it has a great conglomeration of grades, contaminations, physical characteristics and types of ore. It was the previous government's policy, and I imagine it would be the present government's policy, to ensure that progressively and not in an unrealistic way, all the companies work towards this object of reaching out to bring into their operation ores of different types which need beneficiation and processing to convert them into a marketable product. It would be a tragedy if we took the best and left the rest and trusted to luck about the contaminated ores, the lower grade and the friable ores and the otherwise less attractive ores. My own guess is if the Pilbara is administered successfully by successive generations, it will still be operating on an economic basis in 200 years' time. I do not think that that is an extravagant estimate, especially as the tendency will be to use more and more of the natural product in a beneficiated and processed form on the spot rather than export the natural raw materials. In other words, I believe successive generations will see a reduction in the amount of unprocessed ore going to other countries, an increase in the ore that is processed in one form or another in the state, and I do not mean that it will all be processed to, say, the unfinished steel stage, but at least into pellet and agglomerate form. And the vision and what we have today are obviously substantially different to what we had then, albeit there are significant amounts of ore being exported. We are now dealing with production and export in substantial proportions. BHP and Rio Tinto collectively export nearly 600 million tonnes of raw natural ore with no downstream processing in place in the state. And these two companies had been given very favourable concessions with the aim of delivering their two key points: to establish the mining industry here in Western Australia and to undertake a downstream processing activity that would utilise the low-grade ores, create a new industry, one that would be a major economic contributor to the state.
Fair enough.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. But it is one of the examples within the agreements where it was a very clear tenet of those legacy state agreements that there would be downstream processing. And like I said, it's not without, they have tried over the years, and members would be aware of the Rio Tinto's high smelt plant. And there will be those in this house that remember this better than I, because it was some years ago. Sorry?
Yeah.
Rio Tinto.
Rio Tinto.
Yeah. And for a period of some 20 years, I'm told, Madam Acting Speaker, that Rio worked to develop this technology that would allow them to meet their obligations within their contracts. And it was in 2002 that they confirmed that they were going to build a $400 million high smelt pig iron plant in Kwinana that would process 800,000 tonnes of ore a year. And there was an article in The Age about that time in 2002 titled "High Smelt Promises Rio a $30 billion windfall," saying that they expected to reap $30 billion from this plant by effectively doubling iron resources by using the currently unsaleable low-grade ore found within its Hamersley Range leases. And so its long-term vision for this plant was to process 1.6 million tonnes a year by about 2015, at which point it would have considered building a steel mill on site. And to build this plant, Rio actually came to government and asked support from the state government to assist them in funding it, to fulfil the downstream processing obligations that were in their state agreement, that was part of the contract that they were given for the privilege of developing this wonderful resource. 2002 is when they made the announcement. So more than that, they actually went to the federal government and asked for some more money. So they got money from the state government. They also got $125 million from the federal government. Then the Gallop Labor government gave them $30 million to develop it. And Sam Walsh, the former iron ore CEO, said that this was going to be the new chapter in the history of steelmaking, essentially. And Mr Walsh was quoted in The Australian in 2006 saying that there has been a lot of interest in high smelt, with virtually every steelmaker in the world visiting the Kwinana plant, as well as the President and the Premier of China, which showed that people could see the promise and opportunity that high smelt offered. Rio has been negotiating to sell the technology to plants in China, Europe, North America and India, particularly those considering expansions. And its executives believed that 5 plants could be operating in the Asian region by the middle of next decade. Mr Walsh was less sure if Rio would build another high smelt plant itself, reflecting the company's long-held position that it is an iron ore and coal supplier, not a steelmaker. Some members in this place will recall that ultimately the Kwinana high smelt plant went into care and maintenance in 2009 and it was decommissioned in 2011. And Rio Tinto then signed an MOU with Jindal Steel and Power, and it saw its plant operations outsourced to India. Remembering that we had actually provided as a taxpayer $30 million from the state and $125 million from the federal government to assist them in meeting their own obligations within a state agreement. In 2014, the plant was actually moved to China, and Rio Tinto actually sells this technology now via a licence which is used in a number of countries. So essentially the plant has been outsourced and so too has the technology, but there isn't anything here in Western Australia in terms of a downstream processing opportunity. So at the time, the Sydney Morning Herald quite rightly pointed out in 2013, not only did Premier Jeff Gallop commit more than $30 million of state taxpayers' funds towards ensuring its success, and a $125 million federal government taxpayer-funded grant was given, we can reasonably assume that our tax system provided for the high smelt business costs, which was estimated to be $1 billion, to either be written down or off as research and development expenses. And you have to ask, where was the benefit for Western Australians in this transaction? And it actually spawned an article, Madam Acting Speaker, from Larry Graham. Many members in this place, well, some members in this place would be familiar with Larry. He was the member for Pilbara from 1989 to 2005, and he wrote an article for, I don't know, it was online. I'm not sure where it appeared. It might have been the Pilbara News. But Larry, and I'm going to read some excerpts in this, because Larry wasn't one to mince his words when it came to the Pilbara, his beloved Pilbara, and the value that we were getting from this finite resource. And he starts the article by saying, in one of the best speeches I have read in many years, Liberal Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey very accurately said, entitlement is a concept that corrodes the very heart of the process of free enterprise that drives our economy. Some of our free enterprise corporations have that corrosive sense of entitlement, but for some reason they seem to get treated differently to other welfare abusers. Corporate welfare is a silent cancer. It is where our governments take from the needy and give to the greedy. Usually these gifts are to help companies do what they should be doing anyway. Corporate welfare recipient Rio Tinto, which only made $5.2 billion in the first 6 months of 2012, has announced that the taxpayer-assisted high smelt project in Kwinana would be relocating to India. This is a major body blow for WA, particularly because when the project was launched, then Premier Jeff Gallop committed more than $30 million of state taxpayers' funds towards ensuring its success. And then he speaks about the $125 million from the federal government and asks whether or not we get that back, which I think is a fair enough question. And the member for Cottesloe is quoted in the article. I'm not sure whether you've seen this article, member for Cottesloe. This is from 2004, where the member for Cottesloe said, however, about 2 months after the election, Rio Tinto had gotten a deal from the Labor Party and state and federal subsidies. It's outrageous that the taxpayers had to subsidise the world's second largest international mining house to do a research and development plan, which it was obligated to do in any case and do in an urban area. The member for Cottesloe, I'm glad you're in the House, but you also made another very pertinent comment, and in May 2013 and 2003, a good government, a government that has both a, excuse my language, Madam Acting Speaker, left and right testicle, would stand up to the Rio Tintos of this world and tell them that they have the benefit of the most fabulous iron ore resources since the 1960s, and they have a clear legal obligation to develop and process that iron ore. And I agree with that sentiment. We agree with that sentiment, and certainly an inquiry would allow, from our perspective, some of those issues, some of those tensions that whichever side of government you sit on, whenever it is in a point in time, they exist between the community, the corporations, the organisations, and they deserve to be articulated. Like I said, Larry was never one to mince words, but the sentiment I think is absolutely correct, as was the sentiment for the member for Cottesloe. And I go back to this concept of balance. I go back to the concept of institutional capture. No government should be scared to tackle these issues. No parliament should be reluctant to examine such important contracts. And I do look forward to members of the government and even those to the right of me explaining why we shouldn't be aiming for having an inquiry that allows us to canvass some of these issues. We shouldn't be aiming for being open and transparent for some of these most important contracts. With examples like this, and that is a very obvious one, and there are many others that are embedded in these contracts, it is absolutely right that we examine the nature of any of the residual value adding commitments in the state agreements and, by extension, assurances to the people of WA why such commitments are honoured. That is one of the terms of reference we are proposing for the inquiry. So I think our question continues along the lines of what is the outstanding value to the state, given we provided those incentives in the form of those extraordinarily favourable conditions that some of the members for the Nationals will articulate as part of this debate for that specific purpose. What other obligations have been failed to meet or have been deferred or have been washed out? There are certainly those that we can find if you read through Hansard that are reported, but I have no doubt that there are others. I've certainly had it explained to me that there has been the ability for ministers to do that without having to report to the Parliament. There is no requirement, or it was identified by the Auditor-General in 2004 and in subsequent reports that there needed to be better reporting mechanisms as part of these state agreements to the Parliament, not just significant changes but all changes, particularly for these legacy state agreements that don't have an end date. Where is that transparency and accountability, and how do we establish and deliver a process that is transparent and accountable to the people of WA? And these issues, Madam Acting Speaker, speak to the heart of why we think, as the Nationals, we need an inquiry into these legacy state agreements. I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about the local content provisions in the legacy state agreements. And in the context of the local content provisions, which was very much, again, a central premise of those state agreements, Sir Charles Court spoke about it at length, as did other members when these were debated. The legacy state agreements contain a clause that's couched in the following terms. So far as reasonably and economically practicable, the proponent shall use labour, materials, plant, equipment and supplies available within the said state where it is not prejudicial to the interests of the proponent to do so. If you compare, Madam Acting Speaker, that clause to BHP Iron Ore Marillana Creek Agreement from 1991, so substantially more modern in terms of timing, states that BHP, under clause 15.1a, must use Western Australia labour, including specifically labour from the Pilbara. If not, Australian labour must be used. If not, the company must demonstrate it is impracticable. Might just be a different way of saying it, but it certainly is very clear, the intent in these later state agreements, that there needs to be a commitment to Australian labour. This clause calls on the companies to specifically use labour from the Pilbara, not FIFO, and we've had this discussion at length, and it is these workforce mechanisms that directly impact the communities where these companies operate, in the regions that they operate, and they must be strengthened, they must be looked at. The Minister for Industrial Development at the time noted that these companies invested quite a significant amount of money into the townships that the workforce was living in or a part of, and that again was a part of their commitment and their obligation to enable them to access this wonderful ore resource. And the Minister said at the time the companies not only wanted to secure a workforce, but they wanted a peaceful one that would cooperate and be happy to perform the assigned work to the mutual advantage of the companies and their employees, and of course to advantage of the whole community and ultimately the state. And there's a whole series of Hansard that you can read through, and it goes. It's almost like we're having a very similar debate now as to what they were talking about then. And the outcome of that debate is that very much the members of Parliament at that time and the companies themselves acknowledged that it was better to have a normalised community, and that these workers felt more and were more productive when they were in that environment, and that it was important from a state development point of view to continue to drive the agenda of ensuring that those communities become normalised and can actually move away from a model of flying in and flying out, essentially. The member for Pilbara at the time was a Mr Brian, I'm going to get this wrong, Soderman, I think. Soedman. He noted how restricted and unconnected some of the communities were. This was in the 70s, 79. People who have resided in company towns for a long time felt somewhat suppressed by the fact that their social life and their community and business activity to some extent had been restricted, not purposely by the company which managed those towns, but the companies are not in the business of social welfare and housing or looking after the day-to-day needs of the people they employ. This is better done by the individuals themselves. So in 1979 there was an amendment to the Iron Ore Mount Newman Agreement Act, and that became the first of 3 subsequent amendments to state agreements that allowed for the normalisation of some of these communities operating under the guise of these mining operations. And it was considered essential at the time, Madam Acting Speaker, that that land became available for private development and that the state would assume the normal responsibilities in respect of services and infrastructure. And then the workforce would be free to use the infrastructure and the services as they would in a conventional town. And certainly the desire of the Parliament at the time and the government and the companies, I wasn't there, but that was certainly the direction that was taken. And a key part of that normalisation strategy was that the Mount Newman Mining Company developed a very generous home ownership scheme. And so the employees were given the opportunity to actually purchase their own homes. Yeah. And I think that's very important over a 25-year period. And the member for Pilbara at the time said it was one of the most important decisions to have ever been made. And back then, recognising the importance of a residential workforce. The Minister for Industrial Development referred to the same thing, said it was an incredibly important step. And the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, who was Malcolm Bryce at that time, said that it was, again, a shift change in the way that these companies and the community was benefiting from this significant resource. It was clear that there was a clear and very evident desire at the time to see more people settle in Western Australia, and that normalisation would be part of that underpinning of community development. And yet, and yet we still see from some of these companies that operate under these state agreements a very strong preference for fly in, fly out. I'm not saying they do it exclusively, and certainly the example of the Woodside situation that has arisen, which we aren't talking about as part of this inquiry, but is certainly causing a great deal of angst, is that the state government has a responsibility to make sure that you hold true to the desires and aspirations that were articulated under these agreements, and that governments of every persuasion since have said it's important to have those communities being built, and that there is some benefit from having such a marvellous and significant resource in this state. Any decision to move away from that and to allow that pendulum to swing towards where no doubt some of the companies would prefer it to be, which is to allow them to streamline their services to drive down supply chain benefits and their costs, simply means that those communities will cease to thrive. And that is a decision that this state government right now needs to make in relation to Karratha and Woodside. But there is certainly, when you go back and look at the Hansard over a long period of time, very clear understanding that these state agreements were about delivering benefit over a multiple of generations, not just dig it up, ship it out and move on. And the Nationals, most certainly as a political party, remain focused on that. We agree that there needs to be that tension between the companies. It doesn't need to be disrespectful or unhelpful. It needs to be a healthy tension of a regulator, a facilitator, but making sure that we are always acting in the best interest of the community and making sure that we are getting something of value for the long term. We understand our role. We understand what that balance needs to be when you strike the role of facilitating the companies to invest and to continue to drive that regional development agenda. And I would point to some of the challenges that I think this government is facing at the moment, because they are standing very close to two of the companies that are operating under these agreements. So I firmly believe that outside of the obligations that are within these state agreements, Madam Acting Speaker, that these corporations absolutely have a responsibility, a social corporate responsibility, to make sure that they are operating in a way that is delivering value and benefit above and beyond what their obligations are. You cannot be an organisation in this day and age and not have an understanding of what social corporate responsibility is. And it is clear in the initial stages of state agreements that the responsibilities of those companies were upheld. However, it does seem along the way that some of this has got lost, and again the Auditor-General pointed to how there was a lack of reporting along the way as well that made it very difficult to make sure that we were keeping an eye on it. And it seems that the companies inevitably became far more focused, or the pendulum swung far more towards lowering costs and increasing production and sending more ore out the door than actually adhering to the nature of those agreements. And I acknowledge that these companies do contribute to the community. I'm not saying for one moment that they don't. We've all visited the Pilbara, we've all been part of some of the initiatives, we've partnered with them to deliver significant initiatives like the Royal Flying Doctors Service. There's certainly a commitment to education. It's not that they don't do it at all. But as a large organisation embedded in our state for many, many years, both Rio Tinto and BHP, and certainly there are others that would fall into this category, this is no more or less than what you should expect, Madam Acting Speaker. And I think this government, in the short 6 months that it's been in power, has made quite the art form out of handing out gold stars to companies that are doing no more than what you would expect or should expect them to be doing in the first place. So we've seen media statements and media appearances and standing shoulder to shoulder with the CEOs and executives. Titles of some of these media statements, we've seen Premier congratulating BHP on expanding their training program, Premier congratulating Rio Tinto on new procurement program. As part of these agreements, these companies are actually required to do this. And so by all means congratulate them. I'm not saying be miserly and don't encourage them. They do good things, but don't shy away from having the hard conversation with them at the other end.
Do you think it's a thank you for a $4.3 million campaign?
Well, it could well be. How well? Well, you're very, very keen to stand shoulder to shoulder. Very, very keen. I think it's a bit fearful to actually take them on. And why wouldn't you be? If you've got someone campaigning against you with a $4.36 million war chest, it is going to impact the way that you make decisions as a government. And I do see and I do feel that the Premier and some of the ministers are falling over themselves to be overly friendly to these two companies in particular. And my point, and the point of the Nationals in relation to this inquiry, is to make sure that that balance remains right. We are a regulator, we are a facilitator. We need to make sure we have a respectful and strong relationship. They are significant players, but it doesn't mean that we don't have and don't hold them to account, and that we don't have transparent and clear understanding of what they are doing within the state agreements that were set out. They have access to millions and millions of tonnes of ore worth billions and billions of dollars, and the government needs to govern for all people, not just a particular corporation. And we do have precedents for changing state agreements, and never once has that been called a sovereign risk, as has been raised by members of the government, other members of Parliament, and certainly the Chamber of Minerals and Energy. That was something that was pushed back into the face of the Nationals and the community when we were talking about the special lease rental around sovereign risk. These companies aren't going to pack up and leave. They're not. It's not a reason to treat them badly, but they're not going anywhere. We have as a state a long and stable history. We are a mature market. Our trading partners understand us. They know that we understand the industry. We are one of the most stable countries to mine iron ore in, and we hold the global record for the longest period of time without entering a recession. So these are things that companies look to. But it's the resource that's the most important from that perspective, Madam Acting Speaker. So any notion that the state reviewing or inquiring into these state agreements that have no end to them would cause them to pack up and leave and drive off to Brazil, for instance, where I've got some, members might be aware, but in Brazil they've announced measures to effectively double their iron ore royalty rate, and the Brazilian government has been trying to modernise their nation's mining regulations dating from 1960. In Tanzania, the parliament has just passed laws that would allow the government to scrap mining agreements with companies and renegotiate them along more favourable terms to country. We're talking about that. We're talking about an inquiry. We're talking about canvassing agreements that we have a very long and stable relationship with in terms of these corporations. Sovereign risk is not this parliament doing what it's perfectly entitled to do, and that to me should never be a reason or excuse not to, because it's not real. Because it's not real, not because there's a risk of sovereign risk. Because it's not real, we should always feel, as a parliament and as a government, whoever is on that side of the house, open or being able to go back and have a look at these. This is a world-class asset. They are not going anywhere, and we need to make sure that we are making sure we get the best out of that asset and that resource for everyone in Western Australia. So any member that stands today and says that these companies are going to pull up stumps because the parliament would like to examine their state agreements 50 years after they were struck is promoting a ridiculous line in my mind. I worked, Madam Acting Speaker, for the Chamber of Minerals and Energy for a short time before I came to this place, and my role was largely based in the Pilbara. I have run the sovereign risk line before. The Chamber has a role to play for the industry, and I've said in this place before, they should, whoever came up with the advertising campaign should be given a bonus because they did a very good job of it. They played a flat butt. They had 3 key messages, and that is the role of the Chamber, is to try and minimise change for the sector, to make sure that there isn't interference so that they can get on with doing their business. That is not the role of government. The role of government is to make sure that they're doing things in the best interests of everyone in this state, businesses, companies, individuals alike. And so I know that industry will resist change. They will resist change. That is the nature of the organisations that represent them, and also the businesses who have been around for a very long time. They're going to point to risk, they're going to talk to uncertainty, they're going to talk about investment decisions. But I take you back to the fact that this is a mature market. We've been around for a long time, and there is no risk. It sounds half right, though. Sounds half right. So it gets enough people worried that you might not want to mess around or even allow the parliament to do its job properly. And I think that means that we aren't doing our job properly. And I do want to give an example, I've got 5 minutes left, Madam Acting Speaker, of the fact that there are companies that do some of these things incredibly well. And I was briefed the other day by BBI, the BBI group around the Balla Balla mine, and some of the members in this place may have had similar briefings, and it was refreshing. On face value, they are yet to have a state agreement signed, and they are yet to put some of these things into practice, but certainly what they are saying they are going to do is refreshing. Sorry, ratified.
What was signed was the decision to have an agreement with government.
You signed the agreement, we've introduced the ratification. That's what we're doing. It's your agreement.
So all I'm saying, member, is I'm not questioning importance or otherwise. I'm just saying as a company and the way that they engage and what they're proposing to do is refreshing. And they are planning on maximising regional jobs. They've got a commitment to regional workforce from drive-in, drive-out from the Pilbara to make sure that they are doing that through construction and also operations. And they tell us that's because it's cheaper. They tell us because it's cheaper. And certainly that's not the line that gets run by other companies in relation to this. I understand every business is different, and in some cases FIFO is absolutely necessary because you have resources that are very remote from communities where people can live. This is not the case, and from our perspective, when there is the opportunity for these companies to have a residential workforce, we would be encouraging them to meet those requirements. And again, it was one of the obligations set out in some of these state agreements to maximise residential workforces, look at the way that you can build the community, and certainly we think there's an opportunity to have a look at that. The company has worked incredibly well with the EPA, from what I can tell. They took a unique approach to the way that they did their heritage approvals. like I said, it was refreshing having this discussion with them. So before I just wrap up, I do just want to say and go back to the proposed terms of reference for an inquiry. It is nothing more than an inquiry. It is an opportunity for this parliament to do its job. I want to return to the notion that there should always be a healthy tension between the government and this sector. The regulator, the facilitator, the company, the resources, they are finite. And I want to briefly talk about the fact that no business should be considered too big to fail. And that was a concept that was around during the GFC with the financial guy. They had extraordinary power with the governments of the day and political flex. And certainly there's been similarities I've seen between some of these big resource companies, the Chamber. Those conditions are there. And that's not healthy. That's not healthy, Madam Acting Speaker. And there is certainly enough literature in relation to this too big to fail that members should go and apprise themselves of and have a look as to how it applies in relation to these legacy state agreements and these companies, and make sure that we as a parliament are not going down the same path, that we are doing our job, that we are making sure we are getting the benefit of this wonderful resource for generations to come. I think from my perspective, if there is no support from this government, I will be extraordinarily surprised, because they came to government on a premise of being open and transparent, of making sure that they were going to deliver for every Western Australian. And if they can't bring themselves to support a motion that says, let's look at this, hold an inquiry, we're very happy for the Economics and Standing Committee of this place to actually conduct it. It is, I understand, controlled by the government of the day. There is no reason why they should be nervous in relation to instituting one of these inquiries, and we would welcome the input from not only the ministers, but certainly some of the members that represent, particularly the member for Pilbara, the resource powerhouse of the state, who has been absent in this debate. Thank you, Madam Acting Speaker.